Throughout my life, I have worked as a nurse in various hospitals. Before joining the hospital where I currently work, I worked in a geriatric hospital dedicated to the elderly located 20 minutes from my home. At that time, I already had some experience in caring for the elderly, so it wasn't something new to me. It had only been a few weeks since I started working at this new hospital when a memorable incident occurred on my second to last shift, although at the time I didn't know it would be my last. That night, I was on the overnight shift and had been awake for almost 24 hours. I was assigned to take care of patients with Alzheimer's, and the patients in that ward liked my presence. My youth certainly brought joy to the people residing there. Among the elderly patients who often got lost in their own thoughts, being left alone allowed them to mentally travel to other places. However, when someone entered their physical space, they were brought back to reality. I was that person who often brought the patients back to the present. That night, I was dealing with several patients, but one particular patient was more agitated than usual. Her name was Alice, and it was the first time I was attending to her. Whenever I entered her room, she would tell me about the voices she heard and the black-clad man she saw in the corner of the room. Another patient who shared the room with her asked me to close the curtain around her bed so that Alice would leave her alone. This other patient was a very kind, elderly lady who smiled whenever I was around, but she didn't usually speak much and had memory problems. My shift started that night at 9 p.m., and by around 11 p.m., most of the patients had already fallen asleep, except for Alice, who was still awake. Every time she called me into her room, she was frightened because of the alleged voices she heard and the black-clad man watching her in the corner. To be honest, it was starting to scare me a bit too. I believed that in her mind she was truly hearing and seeing these things, so I felt sorry for her as I imagined it was a terrifying experience for an elderly lady. Even in that complicated situation, I was doing my best to calm her down and help her fall asleep. Out of respect for the other person sleeping in the same room, I didn't want to turn on the TV to soothe her. Instead, I held Alice's hand and told her that everything would be okay, asking her to take deep breaths and relax. I reminded her that she wasn't alone and that I would always be there for her if she needed me. This seemed to work as Alice finally relaxed, and the next time I entered her room, she was asleep. When all the patients are asleep, the night unfolds slower, and time almost seems to stand still. About an hour later, I was in the hospital's linen room, picking up some sheets when I heard a noise. As it was a small and quiet room, and the door was closed, it was strange to hear a noise at that hour. I turned around, didn't see anything, and continued picking up the sheets. That's when I felt something like a hand grabbing my left shoulder. I jerked my head around and looked at my shoulder, screaming and jumping, but there was nothing there. There was no one in the room, but I knew I had felt something grabbing my shoulder. I stuck my head out of the room to observe the corridor. There were no other nurses nearby, just complete silence. I had no choice but to ignore what had happened. I went back, finished picking up the sheets, and put them on my cart. As soon as I finished, I turned toward the door, ready to leave the room. Then I fell to the floor and started screaming, with my heart almost pounding out of my throat. On the other side of the door, there was a man dressed in black, watching me through the glass and smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake up all the patients in the ward. The man dressed in black disappeared from my sight, and seconds later the door opened, and one of my fellow nurses entered the room and started lifting me off the floor because I was completely hysterical. I asked her if she had seen a man dressed in black, and her response was that there was no one else there. We checked all the rooms in that ward and didn't find anyone dressed in black. My screams woke up Alice, who was probably in a light sleep. When I entered her room, she began telling me about the voices, but this time, they were my own screams, were mine. She didn't know the screams were mine. I asked her what the man dressed in black she saw in the corner of the room looked like, and if he was smiling. She looked directly at me with a serious and focused facial expression. She asked me how I knew about the smile. My heart was already racing, but it accelerated even more when she asked that question. Alice started screaming and begging to get out of there, saying that the man was coming to get her. The other nurses entered the room and tried to calm her down. I was transferred to another ward of the hospital that night and ended up going home earlier because I simply couldn't recover from the shock I had experienced. The next day, I messaged the head nurse informing her that it would be my last shift. I explained that I was traumatized by what had happened and said that I didn't want to return to the building. Fortunately, the head nurse's response was understanding and friendly. I have never been diagnosed with any mental illness, and I have never had problems with hallucinations. I know that lack of sleep can cause undesirable effects, perhaps even hallucinations. However, what happened that night was something beyond that. I don't know if my tired mind invented that vision, especially because of the things Alice whispered in my ear during the night. But the sensation of a hand grabbing my shoulder and the smiling man I saw behind the door perfectly match Alice's description. All of this continues to disturb me to this day. It was one of those unique paranormal experiences that only happen once in a lifetime, or at least I hope it's only once in a lifetime.